Hello, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here with you today, even if only virtually. We are here to present the results of a research project that we conducted on non urban communities and the extreme weather events that they are experiencing. My name is Geneviève Brisson, and I'm an environmental anthropologist and professor of territorial development at UQAR. I am accompanied by my colleague Nathalie, who is an environmental sociologist and who also teaches at the same faculty as I do. Before we begin, we'd like to give you a bit of a background information on the study and where the study was conducted in Canada. You can see different maps here on this slide. So we're in the eastern part of Quebec. The study was conducted in that eastern part of the province of Quebec. If we think of the greater Montreal area and the greater Quebec City area are more centralized, the eastern part is decentralized and faces its own set of social and economic challenges. If we use a more bureaucratic terms, we talk about devitalization. This area faces environmental challenges as it is the cradle of natural resources which are extracted to support the Quebec and Canadian economies, such as forest products, minerals, among others. We see that climate change is accelerating in this area, just like in other areas throughout Canada. And this program sought to closely examine this particular area of the province. We wanted to better understand the mixed response and differently scaled actions. We received a grant from Oronos, who initially was more interested in studies that involve biophysics, biochemical, natural science components, but they turned towards living environments to improve the response of our services in matters related to mental and community health and climate change. This is a four-tiered program, so we can move from the theory to the empirical data what is going on the ground. So these are really field studies. So we looked at three fields in particular. So we looked at three hazards. There was flooding. Since this phenomenon is on the rise in the southern and western part of the province, but the eastern part has not been spared. The second is coastal erosion, which is greatly affecting the eastern part of the province. And third, forest fires. The methodological approach we undertook is based on three study cases that I just mentioned. You can see on the map on the screen the first field, the Jordan Betts Bay. It's located in the Côte Nord area, just across from Anticosti Island. Then we were in Gaspésie, where we examined flooding, and also in Gaspésie we examined coastal erosion, knowing that this phenomena is also greatly affecting the Madeline Islands. We were on site. We conducted about 25 semi-directed interviews per site, which was followed by a thematic content analysis. The objective of the case studies was to document the positive and negative effects of extreme weather events on communities and environments as a result of these severe weather events. It's already been several years now. We're talking about less in the last 2 years where extreme weather events are top of mind and in the headlines, even if COVID has occupied much of our time. So the other objective was to describe the responses to these disruptions based on the various phases of the process. So what do we do in these cases? So in the first phase of the hazard itself, but all the way to the reestablishment and what we've learned in light of these situations. So who were the stakeholders who were active? Who were the leaders? Who were the stakeholders that needed to be served? And then we also need to identify the facilitating structures, because what's missing, because these are small communities. And then lastly, was to understand in a diachronic perspective the link that exists between nature and society. And that's the subject that Geneviève and I are interested in. So here are the results. I know I went very quickly through this presentation. So in the results, so each of the communities that we examined have their own realities and their diversity, and we are far from wanting to impact that. But in order to present our results, we wanted to look at the facts, because regardless of the diversity of these communities, these observations are actually stand out and are key in climate change response. So we looked at emergency situations. So the minute that the emergency takes place and the hazard is in full force, what we notice is that the local actors that are frontline, be it voluntary fire brigades, policy officers, and even elected municipal officers, these are really the individuals who are the first line of intervention. So those that we read about in technical literature, so for example, stakeholders from the Ministry of Transport, of the Environment, they are not very well appreciated. It's not that they're not present, but they're not concerned about the individuals and the communities, that this presence is viewed by individuals as almost non-existent. So the healthcare network as well, the moment of emergency. So we need to have the healthcare institution be able to accommodate the individuals. But out on the ground where the hazard is taking place, where you need to put on your rubber boots, and we see the healthcare workers, the ones that we expect to see the Red Cross, but we also talking about the environmental groups, so more community-based organizations that are there to examine the hazard and have more comprehensive approaches, and are able to interact with the human beings and with the communities that are affected. So once the situation has stabilized, and the minute that we're out of the emergency zone, what has really been highlighted is that everybody leaves. So everything that was deployed in terms of the central governments in order to face a situation, all those individuals that were sent out or sent back to Quebec City or sent back to the regional cities, and in the small municipalities are lacking resources. So the long-term presence of measures and the human resources to support them following an emergency is not sufficient to ensure the long-term establishment. And why is it so important? It's because we need to find that resilience. And we talk about the word to put together, because by looking at the different measures that are available, that individuals who are out on the ground or in the territory, maybe some municipalities, but most of the time citizens, and even in the civil society organizations, it's these individuals that come up with the resources that are available. But these weak measures, the lack of resources, does not mean that the reestablishment is not real and is not relevant. So it's really important. We need to understand that the community, it doesn't have any resources, and that the citizens within their means are able to get back on their feet within a certain measures to get back to an interesting point. So when we talk about this notion of taking the bull by the horns by the citizen, so what we'll see that in a municipality there were vulnerable populations, those suffering from mental health issues, the individuals who were displaced because of forest fires, that network was deployed their efforts in order to support those individuals that needed that support. So the type of challenges that we see between that tension that exists between the external services outside the community versus what is being fabricated within the community. So it's not always to institutionalize everything, and it's going to take a bit of time in order to create room for these territorial initiatives, and at the same time to consolidate them and to provide the necessary resources to ensure a long-term, robust reestablishment. But that's something that we're missing here. And it's not necessarily the ministers who have that facility. So you need to be able to analyze the situation. So now the hazard has taken place, and we say, what have we done? How do we prepare for the next event? How do we adapt? And this process of adaptation, we hear often that we lament the lack of management. So one of the things that is missing is really the lack of expertise because these small municipalities do not have urban planners, do not have engineers. Often they will work with individuals just on a contract basis, and then that expertise or more up to date, so they're not necessarily centered on climate change, are not very present in these communities. And often these communities have lost these resources as people move away. And then something else that's very important is the lack of local scientific information. So often we have high level views of Canada, of Quebec, and even at the regional level, but sub-regional portraits per municipality are not common. And it's really those scientific elements that would allow for a relevant management, especially in the decision-taking process. And the last point is really that tension, and I'm not teaching you anything new. So ever since that we work in territorial development, Nathalie and I, something that we constantly see is that tension that exists between the elected officials, the citizens, and the centralized governments, because often the elected officials are sandwiched because they have to roll out decisions that they do not take, and then they have to explain it to the citizens, but they don't have the ownership of these decisions that are taken by the decentralized governments, and therefore find it difficult to explain to the citizens. I was also think add an example. So for example, the lack of scientific information and the place of the municipalities. And it's exactly that's what we saw, for example, in one of our case studies. There was a storm, there was erosion, and part of the village disappeared. And if there had been a quick response from the ministry, it's because there was a scientific knowledge that had been acquired beforehand, because there's a heap of independent researchers that from the municipalities and the government from UCAR that had used this case study in order to document the roads, and so it's very rare that you would be able to find that information. There's several challenges. Climate change. They're not the only challenges that are facing small municipalities. When we're working on subjects and we're working on the climate-related challenges, we feel that's centralized, but there are other challenges that exist. Therefore, the elected officials need to be able to take that into account. And those challenges have an impact on the municipality's response and climate change mitigation. So, for example, there were latent conflicts that that existed, but that really influenced the decision-taking process in terms of climate change events and how they can be prevented. So, for example, in the city of Peripheral, there was very, very strong tensions that existed within the municipal council. And it was a time when there was a large storm that we studied, and that they had to respond to directives that were being given by the ministry. So that's really important to be able to explain to the citizens the different initiatives that are being rolled out, and that the environment, the client in this case, cannot always prioritize when we're looking at the different concerns and imperatives. And so we're talking about in Gaspé, we see recurring flooding. These are not large-scale floods, but they're recurring. These is known fact, but in fact, they're not as important in Montreal, for example, or other in Quebec regions, because we know that there's going to be floods, and then know there's going to have damages and impact. But not all the resources are necessarily allocated to be able to face these types of phenomena. Just to give you an example, we talked about conflicts, but there are all different types of issues. That, for example, in Gaspé, when we talk about there's only one a fireman or firewoman, and the rest are just volunteers. Maybe there's the budgets, the municipal budgets are, very lean. And maybe it's just because it's to think about the climate change awareness, and to be able to strike a balance between that and essential services, because then municipalities are faced with tough decisions, and we understand very quickly that climate is not the only priority. When we talk about capabilities, they're in fact limited, because then we understand that the budgets are not endless. The municipal councils, in terms of politics, they don't have all the powers. So all of that makes it that solidarity among the different institutional stakeholders is very important, and that link between public health, between the fire brigade and the environmental stakeholders or community organizations, that entire network is very important. And over the years, governmental changes, we can say that network has been disrupted by larger scale changes, especially at the government level. So there's a lack of support in terms of material for these small municipalities, and for the actions that can be directly rolled out in light of climate change. So government aid only is provided during extreme situations, but once the event is over, the help leaves as well. But this is something that needs to be worked day in and day out with different teams who are not necessarily mapped out on an organizational chart. So when we talk about centralized reforms, may be centralized, but that we have to look at the territorial impact, and what we see the different Quebec-based government reforms that have been done on the regional level and the different institutions, and we can see how how new powers are rebuilt and how they're handed out to different ministries. But we're not here to judge if it's good or bad, but we've destabilized a network that worked with minimal resources. So when there are minimum material resources, the human resources that are on the territory are not destabilized or disrupted. So we need to see that these functional elements is to live that. It's the knowledge, it's the history, it's how it works from day in and day out. And that's important to take note. So that adds itself to socioeconomic challenges. So for example, the exodus of the youth is very prominent. It's a reality, the aging population. This is something that exists in Eastern Quebec But this area actually has the highest aging rate of the province, and that really has an impact on the government. So these challenges need to be adapted in the way we analyze and we roll out actions in terms of climate change adaptation. And all these effects, all these impacts will have a dominant effect on individuals, on their health, be it physical health and also mental health and also social health. So to conclude, I believe that these case studies reinforce what we already know. And we say that the first part of our research project was more theory-based, so we looked through all the different literature, all the different factors that could have an impact on the mental health of individuals and the community health. And what we saw, it's not something new. But what's interesting to see with a different collection of different case studies that regardless of the hazard, in our Quebec reality and even our Canadian context, it's the same type of lack of preparations or response that are very short term, that it seems that the hazard always surprises up, even though when it's becoming a very current thing, and climate change is a thing that is here to stay. So we see that popping up again in and out, and the same time for responses. So the regional and territorial realities, regardless of the differences, are very similar in non-urban cities, because it's ultimately the same conditions of governance or municipality governance and environmental governance and territorial governance. So what's important to retain is that we see that the impacts and the factors are tightly weaved together. So you can't just work on the climate change impact without realizing that there are factors that are going to worsen these responses or are going to improve them. And Melinda Noblet, who compared small municipalities of Eastern Canada with Senegal, and we could see that this condition of non-urban communities, that was a very important in the way of responding to environmental hazards and events, and also in the community resilience that they could demonstrate. So when we look again at the different measures that are taken at the central level, there's not really anything specific for the municipalities, and much more for the small size municipalities and suburban municipalities. So if we do not take into consideration those type of elements, we are worsening the communities who are facing climate change. And Nathalie had mentioned during the introduction, well, it's true that most often is that the communities are the most exposed, at least here in Quebec, to these type of environmental events. So we're managing a large center, but actually we are in small communities with very limited resources. So even though these capabilities are limited, we can see that community resources are surprising, and we don't know, we're not, maybe it'd be a question of to realize the importance of these tightly woven communities, and maybe go back to this idea of strengthening these relationships and these links that exist between the individuals, be it workers or citizens, before coming up with comprehensive global plans. Thank you very much.